I will refer to this intermittently between Whiskey Box Sonnet or just Whiskey Box Writing Workshop. The reason why I'll go back and forth is because I'm not committed to which title I like better. The sonnet has so much kind of a heavy connotation, and it's kind of limiting, I think, in some ways. We'll talk about that a little bit. I think it also, it might be too limiting, the title. I don't know. We can talk about it and see. But welcome. Cheers. I'm going to start with the Patrick Kavanagh poem. Are folks familiar with Patrick Kavanagh? Right, the old cobbler, farmer out of Monaghan, right? Had the crazy idea that he didn't want to be a cobbler anymore or out of Monaghan and work himself into the ground, although he did work himself into pretty ill health. He was left for, he wanted to be a writer. Isn't that crazy? A writer and a literary critic. So he left Monaghan and the farm to go to Dublin. You know, this would have been about mid-20th century. Go to Dublin, you know, after World War II, after Irish independence, you know, the Civil War and that kind of stuff there. And he made it as a writer. It turned out he actually did make it. And but it, you know, it's a crazy idea. Monaghan's a rough area. I almost got beat up like by a group of 6th grade boys when I was over there visiting the And I kid you not. I mean, they're giving me a hard time. I wouldn't have known what to do. I had a guy that had his ancestors. He was from Monaghan, and he was a little bit mean. He was the guy that was the photographer. I was doing some interview stuff and that kind of stuff. He took their soccer ball and he kicked it over a fence to get him away from us, and then we ran off. I'm like, that was just brilliant, though, because, I mean, like, what are we going to do? Just, I guess, get beat up. But, like, he kicked the soccer ball away. We ran the other direction. So I thought that was a good solution. But anyway, old Patrick Kavanagh. This is what he says, and he's a guy that, like I said, he made it to Dublin and he made it. To be dead. To be dead is to stop believing in the masterpieces we will begin tomorrow. To be in exile is to be a coward, to know that growth is stopped, that whatever is done is the end. Correct the proofs over and over. Rewrite old poems again and again. Tell lies to yourself about your achievement. 10 printed books on the shelves, though you know that no one loves you for what you have done, but for what you might do. And you perhaps take up religion bitterly, which you laughed at in your youth. Well, not actually laughed, but it wasn't your kind of truth. So I want to bring in Kavanagh to start things off. I'll come back to him in the sonnet. As I was saying, the sonnet it is such a loaded. You know, it's such a loaded form, right? And it brings with it all sorts of expectations. So I didn't want to limit things too much. But that's a little variation on a sonnet by Kavanagh. But I don't know if that feels like the normal sonnet you grew up with. You know, like, again, it just depends on your background, whether that matches what you think about as sonnet or not. I'm going to read that one more time. And thinking about it, you know, it's clearly written for writers, right? You know, so, hey, howdy, guys. For writers. So, to be dead. To be dead is to stop believing in the masterpieces we will begin tomorrow. Does that make sense as a writer? Right? Yeah, you ready? To be dead is to stop believing in the masterpieces we will begin tomorrow. To be in exile is to be a coward, to know that growth is stopped, that whatever is done is the end. Correct the proofs over and over. Rewrite old poems again and again. Tell lies to yourself about your achievement. 10 printed books on the shelves. You ever do that, right? Tell lies to yourself about your achievement. 10 printed books on your shelves. And of course, Kavanagh did actually make it to be that successful. William Butler Yeats would be the most famous Irish poet. The Irish Times in 2006 ran a general survey of its readers, like who were their what were their favorite poems. And this is, you know, a highly educated Irish audience. And Yeats had 6 of them in there. No, Yeats had 8 of the top 50, but Kavanagh had 6. And here he is, this rural boy from, you know, nowhere, Monaghan, and he moved to the city to be a writer, and he made it. You know, he made it, and he was known. And you figure all the Irish writers out there and that sort of rich tradition coming out of that small island, right? But tell yourself lies about your achievement, right? 10 printed books on the shelf. Although you know no one loves you for what you have done, but for what you might do. I love that line, right? No one loves you for what you've done, but for what you might do. And you perhaps take up religion bitterly, which you laughed at in your youth? Well, not actually laughed, but it wasn't your kind of truth. So yeah, I wanted to go through it. I always like opening things up with a poem. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, it's just absolutely amazing. It's got that roughness of those Monahan boys, those 12-year-old boys that wanted to roll me there. But it's wonderfully, honestly rough. You know, no one loves you for what you've done, but for what you might do. All right. What I'm doing with these whiskey box sonnets, I've been thinking about this for a while. What I do, of course, around here is a lot of just this and that, and miscellaneous. And I was taking some time back, I was taking some of these old boxes of whiskey, which you have here, you know, break down the recycling, you know, do that fairly often, a couple times a week, right? You stock, do the inventory, and you break these things apart. A lot of it just goes back into the recycler, don't think much about it. But I was looking, and there was this Connemara 12-year Irish whiskey. You know, Connemara is such an interesting place in the, up in the northwest part of Ireland, that godforsaken place where Cromwell in the 17th century, when he was committing genocide against the Irish, he sent them to die up there, and they had the old phrase, "de hell or connait," you know, because you're either going to die fighting Cromwell, or you're going to die once he sends you up there, once he sends you up in that godforsaken area. But of course, the folks did survive and made it. But the Connemara 12-year is this fantastic whiskey with all these sort of histories on there. And I was looking at this thing, and it's just in this flat, broken down recycling, you know, with the Bud Light and the Coors Light, nothing against those things, but just all that kind of commercial stuff. And I thought, holy cow, that thing is just beautiful. It's got that old-timey font, and I just happened to know that that was one of those things they're not, you know, was sent to the U.S. for a limited amount of time. And, you know, when that's it, it's gone. When I throw that sucker in the recycler, no more. That's it. So I pulled it out, and I started kind of fiddling with it, and I didn't really exactly know what I was going to do with it. Probably like a lot of you right now sitting with a box in front of you. Bob, feel free to grab a box, or all of them if you like. Anyone that needs a box, grab a box if you want. You don't have to grab a box. But if you prefer. But yeah, I grabbed that thing. I didn't really know what I was going to do with it, but I was kind of fiddling with it. And, you know, you got those flaps on there. If you're taking them apart, Ian Kersey, you were asking some questions, and Don was thinking about it a little bit. I saw everyone kind of messing with it, considering what they're going to be writing on. And there was something about the flaps on there, and just the way I was unfolding it. It just made me think of the sonnet. And I don't know if that's exactly logical, but that's how it went, right? It made me think of the sonnet. Jesse, you posted on Facebook today when you were describing the event. You know, come on by and get this, check out the Sonic workshop, and that the crafts with, like, you know, your dyslexia, that it throws you off, and, you know, it's this craft lecture, and do I want to really look at all these numbers and craft like that, right? Yeah, I'm kind of inclined to think the same thing. So when I think of a sonnet, I guess as it turns out, when I was opening that box, I think more of direction. Right? You know, we always get, like, what do we know about the sonnet, right? What's the things that we think about when sonnet? I know we got people that teach the sonnet. I know we have people that are just coming in for the first time. But think of sonnet, what do you think of? Shakespeare, yeah, old Shakespeare. Crown of sonnets, what I hear over here? Romance, okay, yeah. Of course, Victor's romantic, but yeah, so romance. What else? 11th grade English class, yes, Ian Kersey, very honest answer from the wooden booth. Yeah?
The way it fits, the way we think and write and speak.
Mm-hmm.
It's more of like so many other forms. So.
Oh, yeah, it is a borrowed form. You mentioned Shakespeare, talking about being borrowed. I mean, the form is over 800 years old, right? It goes back to, you trace that back to the early 13th century. It goes back to Sicily, right? What's that?
Was it legal writs?
Yeah, it was actually attorneys, poet attorneys. If that seems kind of funny to you in this sensibilities, in our current sensibilities, but it didn't seem funny to Frederick II, who was the boss and the running the Holy Roman Empire and that kind of stuff, and he had a whole crew of these attorneys, and they would put together what would be known as the sonnet. And it's hard to trace back the origins. Giacomo della Vente is credited with it, but it'd be like all of us sitting around writing and drinking a few and that kind of stuff. Who knows who came up with what idea? They just kind of were figuring out what was working, right? So it goes back to that form, and it comes into English when we think about Shakespeare's time and Queen Elizabeth, right? So that we think about that period, we get into that English language. No one said 14 lines. The volta, volta, the craft term, right? We got to have a volta, a turn, right? The 14 lines, people have heard of that, right? 14 lines. It wasn't always 14 lines. Yeah, yeah. Is there a rhyme scheme? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's a certain rhyme scheme, right? Can be we think about what are the two predominant or I'm sorry, the two predominant forms. You mentioned Shakespeare, right, Mia? There's Shakespeare. What's the other one? It's written iambic pentameter. Petrarch, yeah, Petrarchan or Italian sonnet, right? And Shakespeare and English sonnet. Of course, there's more, right? There's the Miltonic sonnet, right? There's all sorts of sonnets that want to talk with there's sonnets with an added couple lines. There's double sonnets. There's the crown of sonnets, Jesse. There's all kinds of stuff. But ultimately, I find all that craft lecture to be not that interesting either, right? This is all stuff that we can Google. Just as long as you don't go to Wikipedia, you can get good information potentially on these things, right? So I'm not that interested in the 21st century in the particulars of that. We can all find those sort of things. But rather, I think about the direction. And Lawrence mentioned the volta and the turn, right? And so when we think about those old attorneys in King Frederick II's court coming up with this poetic form that has somehow lasted 800 years, you would think about the way that it moves, right? And so that somehow it moves in a certain way where we look this way, we look a little farther, then we turn and come back against it, right? So there's a certain direction. And when I was looking at those flaps, that's what kind of caught my attention. So I wasn't necessarily thinking with all those particular craft points, although those came into play a little bit when I was doing some of these originally. But I mostly was just, I wanted to pull it out of that heap and do something else with it besides stick it in the recycler. So I ended up writing a little bit in there. And then I was pretty happy with what I came up with. It was kind of fun. And plus I was goofing off. It's like, it's one of those Monday morning things. You got so many things on the to-do list, you're hammering away. And like, just to goof off for 15 to 20 minutes, it's better than going getting coffee, that kind of stuff. So that was cool. That was fun to do. And I mailed it off to my friend Miles Wagner. I think a few of you know Miles. He teaches and runs the creative writing program at Nebraska. I've been writing him for years, so I mailed it off to him. Sam, grab a box.
I wanted to actually do this for you, because we can't really hear you.
Okay. Well,
There you are.
all right. I might move. So, okay, there we go. Thank you. So I sent it off to Miles, and he ended up kind of reading through it and writing me some notes back. And we had a kind of back and forth writing a few letters about it, right? And so it was one of those things I got thinking about a little bit more, and I kept doing a few more. I sent them off to Andy, who's not here tonight, but Andy Wisniewski when he was with Flag Live, and I think I sent a few of them around town and that kind of stuff, and mailed them here and there. And it occurred to me too with the whiskey box sonnet, I think the key to the thing is that you don't keep it. Right, so Stacy, you were asking about reading some of my own writing, or I'm going to read any of my own. I've done 20, 25 of these things. They're all gone, or at least they're somewhere else. I do have a couple of examples I was going to pass out. These are from Miles. So one of them just throw a Wayne Blake quote on there, but I'm going to start passing these around if you want to take a look. Wondering where we ended up with them. That's where we ended up going. I just see what you ended up with. What I always think about that direction, as far as with the form, as far as when I think about it as an argument, that made sense to me. And I don't know if Uncle Don knows that the origin with the attorneys, but I don't know if we always think about that original origin. I think that is something to keep in mind, because Victor, you mentioned romantic love, and we think of that notion. We also get that a lot of times that love is not being returned. There's a certain sense of grief, sadness, these type of things that go with the form when we think about it in English. But it's just absolutely amazing. I think about something that has lasted 800 plus years through multiple languages. I think it's worth kicking around. And what I wanted to do was also incorporate this idea of the whiskey box sonnet. And the other thing is the Japanese notion of renga. And are people familiar with that form? I know a few, like Jesse mentioned renga last week. Renga is, kind of give you the quick summary on that. It is a Japanese form, and it's actually where we get the notion of haiku from. That actually Basho was one of the first people to take the haiku from that. So the idea is you have a chunk of prose, Then you have something like that becomes later on the tanka, another kind of short Japanese form. And then you have the haikus, just that little bitty, the 17 syllables we think about now, at least in contemporary English versions. And it was just a little turning piece within the Ranga. But the thing, it was written by Japanese monks, and it was mostly while they were sitting around drinking whatever version of wine that they had back in the day. And so it was a drinking form, and it was a communal form. And it was something that you take a few notes, you do part of it, whether it be what becomes the haiku part, a little transition, a little prose piece, and you kind of pass it around. It's like, so I thought that was kind of fun. So I thought maybe that kind of openness and looseness of that Ranga form we should take into account too. So what I'm thinking, I'm going to try to pull two things off at once. We'll see how it goes. I was going to pass this around. I'm going to make this our Ranga whiskey box. I think we should just write on here and see what happens. Make some notes. And we'll start with, I'll read a couple of little examples. Robert Hass is one of my favorite folks to mess around with that Ranga form or to describe that Ranga form. And so I'll start that, and I think, who wants to get this thing rolling? Anyone? And it's daunting. There's so much. Right here? Right here, who's got it? Well, it's So I'll give you a little example. Robert Hass, he's the poet laureate when he was appointed in 1995. I remember that because that was the first year I went to Missoula, Montana. I was up there. I had started graduate school. Actually, I was about a month away from starting graduate school. I was kind of living out of my truck, semi-broke, waiting for a place to stay and that type of thing. And Robert Hass was teaching at the Yellow Bay Writers Workshop at Flathead Lake, just north of Missoula. And I think it was one of those things that had he known he was going to be named Poet Laureate, he probably wouldn't have been able to pull it off. Just as far as, I mean, he's a super nice guy, but, pretty small time for a guy that's getting ready to have a whole lot of commitments, right? And, I didn't have any money or anything like that, but they did have some stuff where there were open readings, but I was really curious to hear a workshop with this guy. And, one of my favorite poets, so I thought about how could I was going to sit outside a window because it was summer and it was relatively warm up there and they were kind of open. So I thought if I sit on this other side of the window, I can kind of hear them and that type of thing. And I thought, well, maybe I'll go ahead and just ask if I can sit in the back. And I know that again, a bunch of teachers that know you don't need a crowded room full of people. You can only handle so many, that kind of stuff. But I really wanted to do it. So I got a chance to talk with him a little bit and see if he'd be okay if I just sat in the back. I told him about my plan. I would just sit under the window and out of the way, which I think he thought was funny. I was trying to be serious, of course. But, I think that's the best time to be funny, perhaps. And, and it turned out he let me sit in there and listen to him lecture. And he talked about this Ranga chain in this form and this communal form. So what it is Stacy, it's great that you bravely volunteered to start this thing because really the beginning of it is just a prose piece, right? So if we think of high boons and that kind of stuff, right? They're a prose piece with a little attachment to it. So I'll just give you a little quick example. And then just kind of these very plainly spoken telling, setting up the situation, right? So this is, from Basho. I composed this poem at a temple when I was all alone in the evening in Kyoto. They send me news. It said that I need to return to Edo with many letters from old friends and disciples. Among them Kyoto's letter. And it says we have visited Basho's hut that I abandoned. He also has seen Sosha there, Sosha's poem. Right, so it's just almost like stage directions, right? A little quick little stuff. So it's better. So if you're stuck, you can keep going. One of the things that Robert Hass taught me is that if you have a problem, right, you're having as a writer some sort of problem, you're snagged somewhere, you should put that problem into the poem, right? So that's the way to, like, if you read Hess's stuff, he's got these long, in general, he's got these poems that are longer, and they have these great long lines, and he'll have stuff where he'll kind of have this great, beautiful image, and he follows it out where, like, you can feel the energy, right? As it's followed out, it's ran out, and then he'll have something like, he'll put a little parentheses, and he'll say, and what the hell did I mean by that? And then he'll try to answer his own question, right? So, like, if you're feeling like you've ran yourself out on some sort of interesting image or something has just ran you out, and you come back and you may as well. The problem is, like, I've spent that direction. I need to turn, right? Going back to the sonnet, this is how we'll connect to that sonnet. I need to turn, like, just put the problem into the poem, right? Put the problem into your writing, into your solution. You can always cut it out later, right? You don't have to keep that parenthetical or whatever, those little stage directions. You can cut them out, but the main thing is to get that sort of clarity and that precision. And if that's your problem, get it in there, right? Don't let that, don't let it, stop you. So then it makes sense. He mentions these sort of characters, and then that's where we get these little haiku. And this is Soha's poem. In the old days, who was it that cleaned his pots before there were violet blossoms? So we just got these little kind of haiku, right? And then back to our prose. He also writes, where you live, there's nothing green except a single maple tree, about two boughs high. And then they've got the haiku, young maple tree, your rich brown leaves, they last a season. Right? Gathering bracken from among the shreds of ferns. The day for changing servants to a child's heart is a sad thing. And then he goes on. He has this long prose section that's actually fairly sad about an abandoned orphan on the side of the road. This sort of this disastrous hidden area, and there's a young child that Basho the poet's going by, and he's just he throws it's just this wonderful sort of rawness to it. But they're traveling through, and there's this very young kid that they're assuming is just going to die. The parents have left to die, and so he's tossed some food to him and that kind of stuff, and that's about it. And then it runs through about 10 of these haiku that are all these sort of, so that's the situation, right? And they're all like what we think of now, pulled out of the form as the nature poems, that kind of stuff. And he has this reflection where he says, autumn, it's along the lines of autumn, and have survived the full summer. And you want to read it one way when you're reading the haiku, that it's the poet speaking about themselves, right? Like, I'm an old weathered poet, I'm still in there. But it's within the context of this orphan, right? It's like it's the orphan has still somehow come by on the crumbs and the generosity, even if it's just random generosity of strangers. And it's actually the situation is terrible and harsh. But if you look at just the haiku, we think of it now as like, oh, that's a nature poem, or isn't that a beautiful little nature poem, that kind of stuff. But there's a rawness to it, and it works both ways, right? So the renga is the larger form from which a lot of these other Japanese forms that we know, and the haiku being the most famous one, comes from, right? So it's that sort of, and that's the more serious example. And again, it's a longer piece, and I don't want to get into it. It's actually too incredibly sad, but it's striking to me. But those haiku work in both ways, right? And we see that with that form when it's pulled out, right? But yeah, within its larger context, it changes. So turning back to the sonnet, right? Because that's what we had, a whiskey box sonnet is our idea here. So turning back to that sonnet, I think it's got that. I think a sonnet has that same sort of energy where it feels to me like it's part of a larger piece, right? Even if it's not necessarily, and you don't need to know the history that it's a bunch of lawyers and it's King Frederick II or Emperor Frederick II, those sort of things. But it's got a certain energy, like it's a certain appeal to the way that we get into things. It's been described, the sonnet's been described as something that captures a moment, right? It's the form of a certain moment, a certain energy. And somehow it keeps working. I don't exactly know how that is. I mean, I keep fiddling with it and enjoy reading on various things and sources. I got a stack of them by Jesse if we want to, get into all those. We're only going to be here for about 6 or 7 more hours. But we can pull all those out and read through them. But it's a certain way of capturing energy. And I think that all those little craft tools, going back to those, Jesse, those things that make you dyslexic, it's worthwhile to know that stuff. It's worthwhile to kick it around, to suffer with that stuff in the same way when you're like learning a second language, right? It seems like a bunch of rules and it's really difficult until it's not, until you get into it and get that immersion sort of feeling and keep rolling from there. So I think that we're at the part of the lecture where we should drink a little more whiskey and start writing or whatever you got, Yeah, but we should keep rolling through this thing. And have you got your prose piece written? Okay. Yeah. Well, and Warren's a novelist, so you know he should be able to fill that thing up in no no pressure. No, he might do the haiku. But the whole idea is that you're looking at what came before and you're riffing off of it and you're just messing around with a little bit. I got some other arts and crafts stuff. Maybe I'll see if I can get Pickles to turn on some music. We'll turn into the fun part. We'll rotate around. It's sort of like, in some ways, this reminds me of. I don't know if anyone's led like whiskey tastings or wine tastings, that kind of stuff. If you're the speaker, you can talk about what's in the whiskey. You can talk about what's in the wine and the characteristics. You can talk about tannins and histories and what kind of barrels things were aged in. But ultimately, it's better to start drinking, right? So that's the same thing. It's better to probably start writing, right? So you've got your own box in front of you. You've got this box going around. The only real rule with the whiskey box sonnet is to sort of look at what's in front of you, as far as, and again, the front of you being your imagination, your memory, whatever you're pulling in there. Have fun with it. Open up with it. Fiddle a little bit. And then at the end, if you really love what you wrote, make sure to send it away. No taking pictures, no preserving, none of that kind of stuff. I'm looking at you, Levi. Right? No preserving. It needs to go away. You have to mail it away, right? So you can mail. You can just give it to somebody. You can hand it off. Steve Martin movie, The Jerk. And that was, yeah. Remember Navin R. Johnson? Yeah, that's the one. He gets into the phone book and he knows he's made it, but then he gets on the random serial killer that opens up the phone book, and Navin R. Johnson sounds like a typical random son of a bitch, and then he goes to kill him, right? You know, like, it's not a key part of the story, but it's important to Navin R. Johnson, and he can't figure out why it's just random. I've done that, but like, not trying to kill him, of course. I'm just sending them stuff like this. I used to do this with in the 90s with different versions of you remember the old dot matrix printers? I used to have like that kind of scroll paper like that, and I had done that with like cut and paste and just kind of messing around with things. Sent it off to various people I knew, and also famous people. Back when Allen Ginsberg was still alive, I sent it off to Allen Ginsberg, and you know what? He wrote me back. So he wrote me back. I wrote he actually had a Lee Poe poem in there, and kind of like, it was really cool. Actually, it was Miles Wagner and I, the guy that mailed those whiskey box sonnets back to. We'd send those off. We sent them off to William S. Burroughs. He didn't write back. There's all kinds of other people that did not write us. In fact, that was the majority. But every now and then they do. So I think the main thing is to be playful, have fun with what's right in front of you, thinking about those forms, angles, that sort of random association, those type of things. I think that's how the form works best. And then the main thing is don't keep it. Don't keep it. I hate this sort of notion of, and I know actually a lot of you do too. I just pick on Levi because he happened to make eye contact with me. I could see him perk up. But I think that the key is like, let the words do their thing. Send it off into the ether. Let it be done. You know, you don't. You is right. You can sign it. You cannot sign it. It doesn't really matter, right? When we think about this form, you're writing in an 800-year tradition, right? And nobody remembers exactly who did what, where, when, right? And through multiple languages, it's traveled throughout the world. There's just some sort of energy that I think is worthwhile to get in there and see what happens. I'm going to read just a little poem while you're writing, just throw it in the background, and then we'll start the and pasting. I got glue if you want to sniff that. We got scissors too. You can pass that around. Whatever you need. Did I say that out loud? No. Whatever you need, whatever you want to do. We got crafty stuff. You can cut those cylinders. I think Lawrence had like a cylinder or something like that, right? You can cut that thing, gut it. I don't know. I work with a whiskey box because that's what I'm around a lot, right? If you're doing other things, it might make sense to work with other things. I don't know if you're a carpenter, how many 2x6s the boss will let you, draw on, but there's got to be spare parts here and there as you're sweeping up, throwing crap in the dumpster, right? That you can write on that.